All right, let's get going here on this fine, very warm Monday. Alrighty, so I'm not sure what that does. Nope. We'll leave it like that. Okay. So, still echoing a lot on the stream. Not sure what to do about that, to be honest. Because I've got the mic turned down quite a bit. If I turn it down too much more, that one's turned off entirely. I will try to turn the mic down a little bit, but it might just be how it is, unfortunately. But I will try to move the microphone away from myself a little bit. Okay, you're probably hearing the feedback off the speaker is all. All right, so I don't know if that's going to help. All right, so last time we were talking millennials, right? So we're going through our kind of generational cohorts and finally reaching our last kind of two that we're going to talk about for the course, which are the millennials and Gen Z, and we started in on Gen Z. Oh, interesting questions. Everybody's saving their questions. Do I have some effect turned on by accident? Do I have like reverb turned on? I don't even know if there's reverb in. Filters, no, I don't think so. Nope. Do not. Here, I will try one more thing. I will try. All right. See, now you won't be able to hear much of anything, I think. Especially when I move away. All right, how's that? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Any change? All right, I guess we'll just have to live with it, and it'll be what it is. Because I don't know, I don't have an effect turned on as far as I can tell. Nope, have no idea. So, la 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 la, no echo? Okay. I don't know, we'll do our best. Again, you can come to class if you don't like the echo. Okay. Let's clear that. Yeah, probably next class I will talk a little bit more about the midterm. I forget, I want to say the date is the 7th, but now I don't remember. And I'd have to look at the syllabus, but yeah, we'll talk about that soon. Okay. So, a few questions apparently. Yeah. Okay, so a few questions apparently from over the weekend. Why are millennials more optimistic than previous generations? I mean, there's no, I think, really clear answer. It seems to be just a generational thing. Probably, has a lot to do with upbringing and socialization. Baby boomers would have told them, that their future was bright, how special they were. If you worked hard, you were going to do great. And that ultimately seems to have kind of affected the way they think about the world in general. And that, I think that's probably what is going on in terms of their optimism, right? If you're told everything's going to be great, you tend to think everything's going to be great. And that is a lot on the baby boomers for lying to us. No, I'm kidding, of course. All right. Are all forms of religion declining for millennials or mostly institutional? I am going to answer that question by saying we're going to talk about that later in the course, right? There's a whole really long answer in there, but Yeah, we're not. We'll talk about it when we get to the unit on religion and spirituality, because otherwise I could go off on a 45-minute tangent on just this question, and we don't have time for that. But we will come back to this question. I think it's an interesting one. So just hold on to it until we get to that unit. Decline in religious faith, part of the reason behind more people having sex before marriage? Definitely, right? There's definitely part of that. More individualism. I mean, just the ability to have sex without risking pregnancy, right, because of contraception is also probably a bigger factor. Sorry, I was reading about this before Christmas, and there's some debate as to which one is the causal agent here. Most people have assumed that it's, more sex before marriage, and things like consuming pornography that's having a causal effect, it's religious faith that's having, and the decline that's having a causal effect on more sex. It could be the other way around too, and I think there's a statistical argument to make that it might be, having more sex is putting a downward pressure on religious belief, and there's some reasons to think that that might be the case. But it's a good question, but it's definitely, they go together. What the actual kind of direction of the causation is a little bit of a question. Okay. I fixed my pen. All right, I'm so happy. So we ended off on this slide. We didn't talk about anything that was here, but we're going to pick it up here. Okay. With millennials, and this is going to be the case as well for Gen Z. Gen Z now is moving as a cluster into kind of emerging adulthood. So we are seeing, this kind of same phenomenon happening that happened with the millennials, and basically what kind of happened with parental relationships as they become emerging adults. Most of the respondents found improved relationships with their parents, right? And specifically, this is mostly caused by the fact that their parents start to see them as adults, start to treat them more, as equals, right? And that improves the relationship. And this seems to happen around 16 to 17 years old, right? Parents start to think of their, youngsters as adults. They need less monitoring. They're, more needing to make their own way in the world. And so they back off a little bit. After 18 years old, they back off even more. And then it's just, not a completely equal relationship, but one that's much more egalitarian, much less you control my life, and therefore those relationships tend to improve as a whole, right? So yeah, they'll continue getting better the older they get. After moving out, things do get better as well, as parents have just less of a say in what happens in people's lives. Okay, now for a significant minority, right, they still have problems with their parents. Not everything gets sunny and rosy, and there are, parents that still try to dominate their young people's lives, or are just not great parents, and this can continue to cause friction, and values disconnects can cause friction as well. All right, we'll talk about a little bit of that, and when we talk about things like, talk about families, and things like the generational stake, right? The generational stake is a big thing that parents tend to have, which is they see themselves reflected in their children, and so they care what happens to their children. And the more kind of stake you have in your kids, the more likely you are to be a little bit controlling. And that tends to be bad for relationships. Okay, so, I don't know why, having the door open bothers me. In terms of morality, one of the big differences we see with millennials is around sort of questions of how they see truth and how that affects their view of kind of morality. What Smith will suggest, I just closed that. You came 12 seconds too late. Yeah, basically, when we talk about millennials, what Smith will suggest is that, well, most millennials had never, in their early adult years, had never read, any postmodern kind of philosophy. People like Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard or Baudrillard, or any of these kind of postmodernists. He would say that essentially the ideas of postmodernism had worked their way deeply into the consciousness of millennials, right? So basically, in terms of kind of their view of, is there a kind of objective truth, right? Is there some kind of truth that is independent of subjectivity, right? Independent of, the way you understand the world, millennials don't seem to really think so, right? So yeah, they're skeptics about any kind of sense of an objective truth. And so, one of the kind of phrases you heard a lot with millennials, well, it's true for you, but it's not true for me, right? So, or, this kind of idea of lived experience or my truth is something that we really see coming from the millennials and really taking over, right? And now this, again, would be contrasting deeply with the silence, for sure. The boomers to a lesser extent, Gen X to an even lesser extent, but all of those generations tended to have some kind of sense of kind of objective truth. For millennials, it's much more subjective, right? They view themselves, and this is Smith sort of talking, but what he found in their interviews, right? They view themselves as being limited to their own perspectives on their own subjective selves, right? So there's no way of getting an objective view of the world. Mia. So postmodernism, fundamentally as a philosophy, one of its sort of truth claims, ironically, is that there is no way to make objective truth claims about the world. That basically truth is, entirely locked into people's subjective perspectives, particularly like if you look at like Lyotard, Foucault, and Derrida, it's really fundamentally linked to language, right? And language, they think, sort of locks you into your own perspective and makes any question of objective truth sort of irrelevant, because no one can get outside of their own subjective experience, the language they speak, and so there's no way to get at, if there is an objective truth, which, a lot of them don't think there is, it would be impossible to access it, because you could never sort of, to put it in, I think, Derrida's words, no one can get a God's eye view of the world, right? You can't exit the world and have an objective view of everything. You only have your sort of subjective view of things. So you can't really understand or even really ever access anything approaching objective truth. This comes along to, sorry, I didn't mean to cross it out, I meant to underline it. This comes along to, sorry, did that answer your question? Okay. This comes along too with a radical skepticism of what, if you wanted to talk kind of postmodern philosophy, you would call meta-narratives, right? So these grand totalizing stories, that are supposed to explain why the world is the way it is, and this could be religion, right? So religions all have a story of the world and why it is the way it is, or even things like, which is the one that Walter Benjamin talks about, the Enlightenment narrative of progress, right? Fundamentally a lot of the kind of postmodernists push back against modernity and the modern narrative of progress that they think comes from the Enlightenment, which is that, we'll apply rationality and human reason to everything, and we're going to make essentially a utopia. And, postmodernism kind of fundamentally rejects this. Now, I should say for millennials, I don't think that last part is necessarily true. They're deeply committed to an idea of progress as well, and that the world is getting better and better, and that if we just apply especially the science trademark, that eventually we're going to reach a kind of techno-utopia, if you will. But, okay, that's maybe a question for a different time. When interviewers, so what Smith said is when the interviewers tried to ask whether morality was based on objective or universal qualities or standards, or simply relative human inventions, they had a hard time getting the research participants to understand what they were asking. The idea of objective truth or universal qualities or standards was really difficult for millennials to grasp in a lot of cases. Okay, right, so this is from Smith and Snell's book, Smith and Snell, not Smith and Smell. It's because there's an M in Smith, so it wants to repeat itself in Snell. Smith and Snell's book, so it seems for whatever reason, it seems they cannot for whatever reason believe in or sometimes even conceive of a given objective truth, fact, reality, or nature of the world that is independent of their subjective self-experience, that in relation to which they and others might learn or be persuaded to change, right? This is a deep-born individuality as well, right? This is individuality really running the show from an epistemological and ontological perspective, meaning that, this kind of sense of Could there be an external truth that would motivate you morally? You know, something like an idea of God, or, you know, a divine, or some kind of deeper order to the universe. You know, whether it's theistic or deistic or something else, right? You know, a natural law perspective. Millennials have a really hard time grasping it, right? However, when it comes to morality, they seem to think morality is very, very easy, right? Maybe I should highlight this because it's important, I think. Get my highlighter out. Right and wrong are easy to discern despite a lack of objective standard. Why? It's not clear why they think that, but they seem to have this pretty strong sense that it's easy to figure out what's right and wrong. And key, I think, morality is common sense, right? That's a pretty key millennial understanding that what's right and wrong, this is just common sense, right? You don't really need to be schooled in it. It's just like it should be obvious to everybody. And I mean, this is a little bit of an enlightenment idea in and of itself, right? The idea that, you know, reason itself should illuminate what morality is. And you can go back to, say, someone like Immanuel Kant, from whom this idea, I think, finds its genesis. I know, you never, talking about millennials and morality, now we're going back to, like, you know, 18th century philosophy. Anyway, all of these ideas have a sort of heritage, and it's useful to sort of think about that. So, yeah, well, how do you know what's right and wrong? For millennials, it is all about emotion, right? You know by attending to subjective feelings or intuition, right? So you just, you know, you don't know the truth of morality. You feel the truth of morality, right? Oh man, there was this way back, and way before your time. But when Stephen Colbert was doing his old show on Comedy Central, his character had coined the phrase truthiness, right? Things just feel right was the idea behind kind of truthiness. You didn't have to know things in your head. You had to feel them in your gut. And this is the kind of millennial sense, right? It's the truthiness is you know what's right or wrong because you feel it somewhere inside, right? Okay, where did those things come from? You know, they were implanted in them by, you know, when they're children, by parents or teachers. Why their parents or teachers should have any great claim to morality is not clear either, right? Like, from where did their parents and you know, and teachers learn their morality, which was passed on? Well, they learned it from their parents and their teachers. And where did they learn it? Well, from their parents and their teachers. So it's just parents and teachers all the way down, right? You know, where did it come from originally? They don't really know. And frankly, they don't really think about it, or they weren't at this point. And yeah, living morally, you know, they viewed thinking and living morally as relatively effortless, right? Attend to your feelings, you know, do what you feel is right, and you're basically living a moral life. Okay. So, yeah, one of the core moral imperatives for the millennials, though, is this idea of harm, right? Basically, you know you're doing something wrong when you're harming others. And so there was no sense in which harming others could be morally justified, right? You kind of knew you were doing things wrong. And this fundamentally, and I know if you took sociology of religion with me, you're already tired of hearing this, but I'll tell you again anyway. Millennials, according to Smith, fundamentally are moral consequentialists, right? And so what this means, right? There's basically more or less kind of three possible sources of ethics, right? So if you want to talk about schools of ethics, there's consequentialist ethics, which you could include like utilitarianism in, right? So what's the outcome of the thing on a social level, right? That's a utilitarian way of viewing things. It's a consequentialist way. But basically, consequentialist ethics are what's the effect of my action, right? So what is the moral consequence? And that's how I judge whether it is moral. Now, there's two other schools of ethics which essentially, older generations embrace to some extent, which millennials seem to have mostly left to the wayside, and that's duty-based ethics, right? You do things because you have a duty to either some greater power, whether it's your God or your country or something like that, right? You have moral duties that come from some source external to you that you are bound to, right? So you need to serve in the military because, your country requires it of you. And that's, the right thing to do is serve your country, right? That's a kind of duty-based ethics. And I think as we saw with Gen X, that sort of duty-based ethics disappeared, especially in terms of something like military service. But you see it as well with like religion, right? You see a much greater discourse with Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z in terms of, you know, the consequences of actions are more important than some kind of objective or philosophical kind of bar on action, right? So like, should you have sex before marriage? Religions often say no, and it's a sort of duty-based ethics, right? Where basically it's like, you shouldn't do it. Why? Because, you know, your religion has sort of commandments against it. For millennials, it's much more like, well, you know, if it's not hurting everyone, right? When you talk about consent, you're essentially talking about a sort of moral consequentialist ethics, right? So, you know, is it right or wrong? Well, was there consent? Well, then it's right. Consequentialist, right? Because if there's not consent, you're doing harm, right? So the moral consequences are bad. And that's, you know, consequentialist-based ethics. And that really is where millennials sort of come down in general, which is why, you know, if we talk about sexual ethics today are dominated by questions of consent, and no other question really gets into the discourse because the whole conversation is shifted into a consequentialist rather than a duty-based ethics. And the last one is, or virtue-based ethics, right? Virtue-based ethics is basically, you do things that build up a virtuous character, right? You know, you do things that lead you to be a good person. We know what those things are. You know, courage is better than cowardice, so you act courageously to build up the virtue of courage in yourself.
Where's the sources from some of this stuff? Where's the data come from?
So this is all from the National Study of Youth and Religion. Yeah, so this is specifically from the first and second waves of the National Study of Youth and Religion. So they surveyed teenagers when they were between 13 and 18 in the first wave, and then moved it forward, I think, 4 years, and then surveyed them again. So they would have been 17 to 22 or 20, yeah. And that's where all this is coming from. Yeah, Mia. So they're principally consequentialist, right? There's always going to be, you know, in any kind of massively diverse population, there's going to be some people that don't fit the bill, but the bulk of them are consequentialists. Okay, right, what was I saying? I got off on consequentialism, and I lost myself. Yeah, so an action's only harmful or immoral if it harms someone. It might not be immoral to do something, right, you know, if it benefits you, but doesn't hurt anyone else, or the harm to them is not immediately apparent, right? If you're cheating in a class, right, that helps you, does it hurt anybody else in the class? I mean, if the class, say, is not curved or scaled, right, then, yeah, it wouldn't hurt anybody else. There's nothing morally wrong with cheating in that sort of thinking. Yeah, why hurting others was morally wrong? You know, Smith essentially says it's a sort of free-floating, unjustified supposition, right? No, millennials didn't have a really strong sense of why it was wrong to hurt someone, just that it was, and that was very deeply ingrained. Okay, and again, it's just common sense. Again, morality comes down to just common sense, and for them, it was just common sense. Okay, some, you know, refer to notions of karma as reasons not to do bad things. And I mean, you want to say this is a very pop culture-y kind of way of understanding karma, which is more like what goes around comes around. You know, if you act in bad ways, well, eventually somehow the universe will catch up with you and smack you upside the head, right? Or something bad will happen to you. It's not, you know, the Hindu or Buddhist idea of karma in its really refined religious form. It's more like, well, bad people eventually come to bad ends. And again, this is not a dominant kind of way of thinking, but it's definitely there in millennial thought. Okay, apparently someone has Walter Benjamin-related trauma. I promise, this will probably be the last time we mention Walter Benjamin. I'll try to keep him out. How do I reconcile millennial belief in a lack of objective truth with the rise of science as a dominant discourse? It is a difficult one. It's an interesting question in the sense that yeah, I mean, there's a really fundamental belief in science as a dominant discourse. And what I would say here is that there's always, we've never, okay, choose my words carefully. Fundamentally, I think millennials and Gen Z haven't quite transitioned completely into a sort of postmodernist ethic, right? Because postmodernist ethics is really hard. It's like, what does anything mean? Nothing. What a helpful philosophy of life, right? Where do people ground any kind of sense of truth? There's a lot of grounding in subjectivity, but I would say there's also this aspect of contemporary culture that also still reflects the fact that modernity hasn't quite been eclipsed, and especially this kind of focus in modernity on the power of reason, the power of science, right, which was really dominant, up to like the end of the Second World War until this kind of, and really into the 60s, until this kind of thinking starts to come in. It hasn't been completely eclipsed, right? And this is why, for example, if you went back to say the 1990s, everyone was talking postmodern this, postmodern that. We're moving into the postmodern age, and getting into the early 2000s and then through the 2010s, almost everybody stopped using the word postmodern in an academic context, specifically because they never quite gave up on this idea of science especially and technological progress as moving to us towards a sort of utopian end. And we're still kind of there, right? We're still kind of in that moment. So everybody, I think now, or not everybody, but the bulk of the discourses now, people are not talking about us being in post-modernity anymore. We're talking about late modernity, right? So if you read the academic literature from like the 2000s to today, you'll encounter the term late modernity a lot, because we've never quite gotten out of this narrative of like what's called the Enlightenment narrative of progress, right? Coming from the Enlightenment, we use reason and especially science and the scientific method, and we'll end up in a place of like paradisical, utopianism where we have flying cars and, now you find in like transhumanist discourses where, you'll be able to upgrade your body, you'll get like a cybernetic arm or something, or, in its extremely futurist form, you'll upload your brain before you die into the cloud and you'll live on as consciousness in a computer, which actually to me sounds like a nightmare. But, somehow I can only imagine Mark Zuckerberg or one of his heirs being the one who owns my consciousness and puts me in some kind of grotesque body in the metaverse, and I'm like, okay, this was much worse than what I had before. Anyway, right, so hopefully that answers that question. We're not quite past modernity. Modernity stubbornly sort of holds a grip on our consciousness. I think specifically because post-modernity is so abstract, and this idea, well, there's nothing that's true, is probably too hard for humans to actually fully embrace, right? Or most of us, anyway. Okay. Relativism, right? Millennials, from a moral perspective, are deeply relativistic, right? What is right, what is wrong? Well, that's different for everybody, right? It's true for you, but it's not true for me. You're Roman Catholic, well, that's great for you, but it's not great for me, right? You think we shouldn't eat animals, right? You're a vegan. That's great for you, but it's not great for me, right? Because I have a different perspective. And so there isn't really a fundamental kind of truth claim that can be made, right? It's all relative to who you are, right? And there's this pretty strong idea that no one can impose or presume the perspective of another person, right? So you can't force your morality on other people. Morality has to be this sort of freely chosen thing. So it becomes very much, about persuading people into different forms of kind of morality. Every individual is different, and each one has to decide for him or herself what they believe to be true. Okay, this one should be quick. By emerging adulthood, right, the millennials had become very tolerant of gays and lesbians, and then as they continue to move through the life course, right, you would add, LGBTQ, Two-Spirit, and all of those things into this sort of formulation, right, they became much more tolerant of all of these things, right? They started actually, in their high school years, relatively intolerant, and grew more tolerant as they moved into emerging adulthood. Substance use, especially marijuana, became very common and was seen as morally unproblematic, right? Alcohol, and even a lot of harder kind of substances were seen by millennials, especially at this point. As they moved, into adulthood, this changed a little bit, especially as the opioid crisis hit. But substances, right, and substance use became quite widely accepted. And yeah, as they became more sexually active, right, they had more sex, they thought this made them more liberal or open-minded, right? And so there's probably a connection here between, point 3 and point 1 on this slide, right? As they became sexually active, right, especially in ways that weren't, related to traditional morality, they were having sex before marriage with multiple partners, they became more tolerant here as well, right? And those things, I think, go together. Okay. I just want to, okay, still going questions. All right. Yeah, so, a couple of things, right? According to Smith, right, they're broadly speaking social constructionists, which, again, is not something that they would know what a social constructionist is. It's just that this particular idea coming down to us from people like Peter Berger, and in some ways from Weber, and Goffman and all of these cats, has deeply kind of penetrated the culture, right? And it's become part of the kind of common consciousness, right? So they believe the social world is constructed, right? And therefore that it is changeable and that nothing is necessarily a given, right? And it's historically contingent, right? It changes at any time. It's invented by humans, and it can be reshaped, right? So basically, gender is socially constructed. Well, that's a big one, obviously, for millennials. But everything, essentially, any kind of human institution, the family, all of these things are sexuality. They're all socially constructed, and so they're all deeply changeable. And yeah, morality became framed in terms of subjective and emotional statements, and especially the millennials, had the, oops, I went the wrong way. I meant to circle this in red. It's the I feel statement. Truth claims became I feel statements. Not I think, not I know, but I feel, right? That's how you frame morality. Okay. So education, kind of following a trend, we talked about this trend a little bit with Gen X, right? This shift away from, I want to develop a meaningful life philosophy versus I want material well-being. The millennials kind of continue this trend, right? And so what happens is that education fundamentally becomes something that is of instrumental value, right? Why do you get educated? Arguably for the silence, for the boomers, and then less so for Gen X. Really just for the silence and the boomers, I guess. The purpose of education in a lot of cases was this kind of connection with the tradition, learning, bettering yourself, right? Becoming a better person by, reading Aristotle and Shakespeare. Once we get to the millennials, though, what is education for? It's to get you a job, right? It's to be part of the economy, right? Because it goes with that trend of, an increased focus on material wealth as the purpose of life, right? Less, I should be a good person. I should have a meaningful moral philosophy or philosophical worldview. It's like, I need to get a job so that I can buy stuff, right? So that I can be rich or wealthy or well off or whatever, right? So I can, buy that house in the suburbs and take my 2 vacations a year, one to Europe, one to Mexico, and that is pretty much, why you get an education, right? It's not about this kind of older sense of what education was for. It's what we would call credentials. Okay. Oh yeah, so drugs. Despite the sort of anti-drug campaigns of the 80s and 90s, drugs were pretty pervasive in youth culture for millennials. Marijuana in particular was widely consumed, as was alcohol, of course. But as they got out of high school and through college and into those first emerging adult years, mostly they reduced or got bored of taking drugs, and that tended to decline, right? So as they kind of mature, there's a youthful experimentation with drugs, and then it declines in those emerging adult years. Okay. So, hot. All right. Very similar to Gen X, right? We saw this trend, you know, with Gen X in Twenge's work, right? This idea of like, you know, settling down is for later, right? What is it? Children, sex, marriage, not necessarily in that order. And that trend just continues with millennials, right? Average age of first marriage rises. You know, for millennials, I think it ended up at about 28 for women, 31, 32 for men. So getting married much later. Yeah, youth was, you know, and youth, a time to try things, right? And especially think about this in terms of like emerging adulthood, or this idea of that slow life plan, or that slow life course, right? Youth here is massively extended, right? Into the end of your 20s is a time to find your passions, right? To travel, to secure, and make yourself secure in yourself as an individual, right? That's what the goal of your youth is. And so things like marriage are the capstone of that, right? It's like, okay, when you're here, right? When you've got, you know, you're secure with yourself as an individual, you've found your passions, you know, you've done your youthful travel, then, you know, you can think about settling down. But until you have that, you know, broadly, that, you know, all those things are for later. And same thing with having children, right? For a lot of millennials, having children is like marriage and then children is a capstone to this. Okay. Yeah, so once you're well underway, your career's going, you know, you're good, then you can think about moving on to the next thing. And again, it's neither right or wrong. There's nothing like, not a moral claim here. It's just different from prior generations where, you know, say for the silents and the boomers, a lot of times it was like, well, we'll get married and we'll figure these things out, you know, once you're married as a couple. And for millennials, it's like, I guess it's that hyper-individualism. I'll figure that out, and then I'll find someone that matches that once I've got me sorted out, right? Okay. Yeah, there's definitely a detachment that goes on with relationships in millennials, right? And you know, I talked about it a little bit. That detachment of relationship and sex from emotion happens a lot with the millennials, right? You know, detachment in relationships. In some ways, you know, relationships for the millennials got a lot more complicated because there used to be a very particular life script that people went through, right? And Twenge describes it in her book when she's talking about the silence. It's like, you know, women were in college and their boyfriend would get their fraternity pin, they would pin them, right? So they give them their fraternity pin, it's a weird old thing. You know, they would go steady and then they would get married, you know, more or less a couple months after graduation. And why did they do it? Because that was the life plan. The millennials completely rip up the life plan. Now there is no life plan, and there is no sort of general sense of relationship progression in a normal way, right? So there comes to be this whole lexicon around relationships, right? People are friends, they're hanging out, they're dating, they're friends with benefits, they're hooking up, they're semi-cohabiting, cohabiting, living alone together. Yeah, please.
Are sociologists starting to look at the concept of dinks?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, so dinks would be dual income, no kids. It's a phenomenon we really started to see with the millennials in terms of people choosing not to have children. And yeah, like basically be like, we're gonna be two kind of married people with two incomes and choosing not to have children. It's definitely in the literature on like families and family forms. And it's sort of, you know, it's considered a sort of new family form, you know, something that was uncommon outside of the realm of like infertility in the past. But now it's a sort of active choice that people are making, which is really different. Again though, it goes along with this same sort of materialism, right? Kids get in the way of materialism and your own kind of self-discovery. And so a lot of people choose to kind of go in that, and I mean, you hear it in the discourse. I mean, sorry, TikTok is probably a bad place to get your general sociological sense. But the dinks on TikTok, right? It's all about, yeah, we travel, we go to Europe every summer, right? Or we have 2 luxury cars and we're in our 30s. I don't drive a minivan, blah, 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 blah. Like, they're better than me, which they probably are. So it's definitely there in the literature, right? But it's really, really novel, right? We saw it a little bit with the millennials. I suspect we'll see a lot more of it with Gen Z. But having kids was almost not, like, especially for, you know, silents, boomers, and Gen X, it was not really a question. It was a question of timing. The question of not choosing to have kids was seen as something, I think, quasi-immoral, or like there's something wrong with you. And that seems to be shifting with millennials, where it's becoming much more common. We're going to become South Korea at some point, right, where our birth rate is like 7.74 children per woman. That's on the way, I think. And then, you know, there's population disasters that come with that. But maybe a question for a different time. I'm sorry, did I answer your question? Okay, perfect. What was I saying? Right. There's a lot of, you know, a lot of different, and this does not sort of exhaust it, right? Like what relationship are people in? And it's not kind of linear, right? It often goes like, you know, friends with benefits, or friends hooking up, friends with benefits. Oh, back to friends, right? It's like, or you get ghosted and the process begins again. The course is much less defined, right? And technology plays a role here as well. We talk about sex and intimacy. We're going to talk about Tinder and all those fun things and online dating. It'll be a blast, I promise. And yeah, things like whole new ways of having to learn how to talk, you know, things like relationship defining talks, or define the relationship talk, right? As people uncertainly move through this number of steps that aren't clear, you know, they often have to define where they're at in a relationship, whereas before, right, it would have been somewhat apparent, right? If you were, you know, I'm going to be stereotypical, right? If you were a silent and you were, you know, your boyfriend gave you their fraternity pin, right? It was obvious to everyone what step in the relationship you were in. It was like pre-engagement, right? And mostly you knew how that progression was going to go. For millennials, it becomes much less clear, right? And so this, defining it basically, various kind of, you know, encounters of a romantic to sexual nature, anything from kissing all the way to having sex. Okay, yeah, I mean, there's a pretty strong argument, and Mark Regnerus makes this in a book called The Future of Marriage, that marriage is probably going to hang around, but it seems to have lost a lot of its cultural utility, right? Or at least people perceive that it's lost a lot of its cultural utility. I mean, there's been people in recent years like Louise Perry who've been making the case that actually the most feminist thing that people could do is to bring marriage back. That's maybe an argument for a different time. Yeah, marriage kind of seems like it's on the way out, right? Marriage rates per thousand are declining tremendously among the millennials, and it'll be the same amongst Gen Z. Cohabitation in some ways has replaced marriage. It was at first a buffer, like between, you know, living together and marriage, right? Or dating and marriage. It's like, okay, let's test the relationship out. I can't remember what influencer I was listening to on probably TikTok, actually. It's satanic and steals my time. And I think that, you know, this was like, well, you're not even really dating someone until you've lived with them. And I was like, wow, that is a profound statement in some ways, right? Like, it's so different from what came before, right? The idea that you wouldn't be dating someone until you've lived with them and you've seen where they leave their dirty socks, right? That's what you need to really be dating. Okay, interesting. Sociological kind of way of reading things. Okay, and yeah, millennials want to mitigate risk as much as possible. This has often been put, you know, because they were the children of that big divorce spike that happened in the 1980s, and, you know, cohabitation is a way of sort of testing out relationships. Okay. Right, I could do this. So, in terms of, you know, again, that move towards materialism that we saw starting with Gen X, we see a lot of it too with the millennials, right? Yeah, and I mean, I think I can't remember, I was talking to someone at the end of last class, and I suggested, right, that this is probably an outgrowth of the end of the Cold War and the disappearance of the Soviet Union, right? That millennials living through that transition, right? The oldest millennials would have been 11 when the Soviet Union disappears, and with it, this kind of alternative economic system, a way of looking at the world, right, of socialism or communism disappears, right? So millennials really embraced consumer culture, And basically, a good life is a life of consumption, right? Is owning things, is of being wealthy, of having whatever you want. And it was moral, right? As long as you can afford to buy it, right, you're totally entitled to purchase whatever you want with the wealth that you'd acquire. Less common for millennials. We'll see a little bit of an uptick with this for Gen Z, although Gen Z is still pretty materialistic. We should take care of each other, right? There's a kind of duty to care for other people. Millennials, though, mostly think of this as the duty of the state, right? So taking care of each other is mostly done through taxes and the government, not something they do hands-on. Volunteering and donating and actually helping people, if they were going to do it, most of them actually thought it should be done by the state, but it was something they would do later in life. Again, once they emerge from that slow life plan into full adulthood, then they could think about volunteering and helping people and donating, but not until then. But most of them, right, it's the middle class lifestyle that they aspire to, the American dream, if you will. Oh, that's okay. So that's a huge question. Yeah, most emerging adults, at least amongst the millennials, basically doubted the ability to really change the world. So while they were social constructionists, they sort of thought that they couldn't actually affect what was happening in the world. They were sort of powerless, which is a weird sort of way of thinking, but it was what Smith and his team found. Mostly, in the emerging adult years, and this is probably not abnormal, they were submerged in their interpersonal relationships and weren't particularly engaged with the major cultural or ethical debates in U.S. society. What they suggest is almost none of them have a vision of the common good, right? That there should be some way in which the common good, the good of everybody, is put forward by the system. And following Gen X, right, citizenship and the duties to the state, right, are not something millennials really thought about. So we're a long way from, John F. Kennedy's ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. For millennials, it's all ask what your country can do for you, right? And that's pretty much it, right? Okay. Deeply engaged in their private lives, and what makes emerging adults happy is the relationships with friends and associates and people they know. And increasingly, this was managed by technology, right? Increasingly, this was run by social media. Okay, I will try to answer this next time. This is a huge and complex question, and then we'll get into our last section for this unit. We're going to talk about Gen Z. It'll be great, super fun. Let's go. All right, I'll see you on Wednesday. Man, I feel like I need more time in this class. All right, have a good one. Yes?
I'm wondering, do you think I'm doing a disservice to myself by not reading the textbook? Because I know in the beginning of class you said it wasn't necessary if I'm coming to class, but I know the midterm's also in a week and I don't feel ready.
I don't think so, because of what is in the textbook is honestly just the back half of that history unit, right? The rest of it is really I'm just telling it to you, right? So I wouldn't say so. I think if anything, submerging yourself in the textbook, you'd get a piece. The Postman book is a quick read, it's a super short book. You could read it really quickly, but I think everything I've presented it as completely as I can.
Okay.
So.
And then do you have any suggestion on how to start studying for the midterm? Just because it is next Monday, so I'm not sure.
Worrying about it?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how to study for it because I know it's different than most of the sociology exams I've taken.
Let me think about that, and I'll talk about it on Wednesday.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So similar to how marriage was kind of the capstone after you completed yourself as an individual.
Yeah.
All this